This is a good place to do it.
This is very good place, yeah. And it gives kind of supportive atmosphere for our conversation.
Yeah.
And you play really well, I can tell you. Compared to me, of course. My mother is actually teacher of piano. Yeah. But I was lazy.
Mm-hmm.
You know, it's like the burden of your parents that everybody supposed you have to continue his or her track in the life. But maybe I have my own interests.
Yeah, well, it's a tricky thing with music because it's not fun until you get good at it, and then it takes a long time to do that. So it's a tricky thing to manage if you're a kid.
We are ready. Are you ready? Yes. Good, then we can start. Is it recording now?
Yeah.
Good. Very warm welcome to Estonia, Professor Jordan Peterson.
Yeah, it's great to be here. Lovely old town, beautiful weather.
Oh, it's summer.
Mm-hmm.
You're author of several books, and among them is the book. This copy I bought in Sweden, Arlanda airport, when it was not prepared for Estonia yet. It's translated now. It's 12 Rules for Life, an antidote to chaos. And obviously you have touched something very important, and especially for a younger generation. And if I may abbreviate very briefly, say what is a core for me after reading this book, is the understanding that nobody, either a man or a woman, should expect the good uncle to come and set his or her life. We all have to take responsibility of our own lives ourselves.
Well, you don't have a life without that, because all that responsibility, say, voluntarily undertaken, that's the adventure that justifies your life. Not, people think that, that the purpose of life is happiness. That's fine until you're not happy. And then what? And that's when you need something the most. And so it became pretty obvious to me as a clinician, I would say, but also as a professor, a father for that matter, that most of the sustaining meaning that people discover in their lives is a consequence of the adoption of responsibility. And in some ways that's self-evident as soon as it's stated, but self-evident though it may be, and I suppose my books have been criticized for that. Well, you're just stating the obvious. It's like, first of all, it's not that easy to state the obvious. And second, when the obvious hasn't been stated for 60 years, it's time to start stating it again. And so...
Why it has been neglected for 60 years?
Well, I think it was probably a combination of post-war prosperity, in the sense of unlimited horizon. And that makes people positive, and being positive like that can make you impulsive and shallow. But I also think some of that likely had to do with the mass introduction of the birth control pill, because that added another boost to the idea of that a short-term hedonism, even in the most serious matters, so say in relationship to sexual behavior and relationships, that a short-term hedonism was both possible and desirable. And so I think those were the two major factors. There was also a corrosive left-wing utopian stream of thought that emerged, particularly after World War II, that insisted that all social interaction and responsibility was burdensome and constraining. And that is part of a broader Marxist critique, but it's also, I would say, a reflection to some degree of what you might describe as an extreme Protestant liberalism that assumes that only the individual truly exists, and that social institutions, it's Rousseau in some sense, that social institutions are fundamentally detrimental and constraining. Out of that too, you get a rise in the idea of permissive parenting, right? That you don't want to put any constraints on your children because all that does is interfere with the flowering of their creative prowess. And that, again, is simply not true.
Flowers don't blossom themselves. You have to take care of them.
Well,
water,
Yeah, well, the classic image of paradise is a walled garden, right? So the walls imply border and restriction, and the garden needs a tender, and then nature can manifest itself in all of its glory, let's say, at the highest level. And so it's certainly the case with children. We're in this amazing piano factory, Estonia piano factory, and we're talking about the challenge that is posed to children if they want to become musical. There's a tremendous amount of discipline that precedes that, and that discipline is difficult and effortful. It's not even necessarily intrinsically engaging, but the price you pay for full creative realization is subjugation to discipline and constraint. And then it's not really subjugation, right? It's a precondition. It's a forming and a shaping, and there hasn't been a good case made for that, particularly publicly, for a very, very long time. Yeah, like 60 years, a long time.
You mentioned Marx.
Yes.
We here in Estonia, as a former Soviet republic, are quite aware of Marxism, or the Leninism, the totalitarianism and authoritarianism as it was exposed on us, and we do not like it at all. We don't like the ideas that somebody is putting rules upon us, and we have to follow these rules. So we would like to be liberated in different way, as we were 30 years ago, to get the freedom for the nation and for our state. And,
you're sort of free then to pursue your own disciplinary structures, right? So it's not free. That's a tricky thing to get right, because I also am I'm very skeptical of centralized top-down planning and insistence. But the opposite of that isn't a hedonic, borderless freedom. The opposite of that is the right to pursue your own disciplined and meaningful pathway, and the responsibility that's attendant upon you to do that. So, and I think that's best, in some sense, best manifested at the individual level, although only in harmony with the encapsulating social groups. So.
Yes, I have the follow-up for my question. So, yes, we got the freedom, but now more and more we are looking towards the West, but I would make comparison to your rule, which says that it's rule number 4, compare yourself to who you were yesterday, not to who someone else is today. Mm-hmm. So we should compare ourselves with ourselves.
Yes.
And actually we have made a great success throughout last 30 years.
Right.
And we should, it's my personal opinion, my humble opinion, we should not always listen to some advisors who say that you have to do this, you have to do that, from West.
Yeah, well, advice is easy to give and doesn't cost the person who's giving the advice much.
Socially correct advice is
well, there's that too, yeah. It doesn't cost the person who's giving the advice much if the advice fails. And if the advice succeeds, then the person giving advice can take credit for it. And so you might say that's a paradoxical thing for someone who's written books of rules and advice, let's say, to say, but I don't really think my books are advice. They're investigations into ethical guidelines, and they're mutual in some sense, meaning that the reader is investigating with me. I'm not insisting on a pathway. I'm saying, well, here's a proposition, something that you can use to frame your perceptions and your actions. Here's how it might be understood. If you find that it would be useful, then adopt it, and if not, well, then there's many other things that you might do. You mentioned earlier the idea of, let me see, the first part of your question was?
We were talking about Estonian liberation from Soviet oppression. And then that sometimes we have advisors.
Yeah, to compare yourself to who you were. The problem with comparing yourself to other people, people tend to do that a lot when they're teenagers. And they need to do that to some degree because they're trying to calibrate who they are, and they're also trying to fit into the social group. And they need to do that. That's why it's so important for teenagers what other people think of them. You don't want a teenager who doesn't care what other people think of them. That's not good. Now that can go too far, right? You can care only what other people think.
Another extreme.
Yes, exactly. But the problem with comparing yourself to other people, there's a bunch of them. One is envy is not helpful. And it's also a form of delusion, you know. I know enough about people, particularly from my clinical work, to know that, you know, you can see the shiny outside of someone, and maybe they're wealthy and they have material possessions that you don't have, but you have no idea about the particularities of their life and what they might be suffering from or why they might be suffering from it. And so you look at the outside and you see, you know, someone in a Maserati, red Maserati with a hot blonde in the passenger seat. You think, man, he's got it all. And you don't know that she's like a high-priced hooker with a meth habit whose father abused her, and he's like racked with guilt constantly and in a sweat because his crooked business dealings are about to fall down on his head. And so that kind of envy, it's a surface delusion. The only person that you really can compare yourself in some real sense is you, because you're the only one, your previous instantiation is the only person who matches your talents and your limitations perfectly, and you can strive to be somewhat better than you were, and you can attain that too. That's the other thing that's so good about it, is that certainly, even if you're not very disciplined, you can be 1% better than you are in 2 months. And that's 6% better in a year, which is quite a lot, especially because it compounds. And in 5 years, with compounding, you're way better than you were. And that's a good thing to know, especially that it can also be done incrementally. And so that, see, it removes envy, because you're not envious of who you were yesterday, unless a catastrophe has beset you. It removes envy. But it also sets you in a position where you can reward yourself for genuine, small-scale, implementable undertakings, because you can say, well, you know, I set out to improve myself in this manner, and I've made this much progress, and hooray for me. And that observation of progress towards a desired goal, that's the core of positive emotion. So happiness, the happiness that people claim to want, is to be found in the observation of progress towards a valid goal. We know that neurophysiologically, we know it psychopharmacologically. That's what positive emotion is for. It's just, or the one profound form of positive emotion, it's to signify that you are moving properly towards a properly valued goal. And that brings up another issue, which is in my writings constantly, that you need a high goal. And the highest goals, whether people like it or not, the highest goals are religious, by definition. Because the highest things are, by definition, religious.
Which are beyond of us personally.
Well, the higher they are, the more beyond.
Wider group.
Yeah, well, they unite people.
Or the meaning of existence.
Yes, all of those things.
Martin Seligman, American psychologist, has said that it's very important to live a meaningful life.
Right, well, meaning is to be found in relationship to the highest goals, technically speaking. So what should you do with your life if you want to have a meaningful life? The answer is, well, you should pursue the highest possible goal, because that's where the meaning is. I mean, and I don't mean this metaphysically. I mean, that's how your brain is set up. If you're pursuing a trivial goal, just a short-term hedonic goal, there's almost no reward in moving towards it, because it doesn't integrate your existence across multiple levels of time and community simultaneously. And you know this in a very deep and instinctual way. And so if you're pursuing trivial goals, then the meaning that's produced will be trivial. And we also know that there's a difference between trivial and profound goals, because we have the language. If I say trivial goal or profound goal, you know instantly, at least to some degree, what I'm referring to. It's not like it's a mystery. And so we have an intrinsic...
It needs experience to understand terms.
Well, and we know this. It's like the difference between reading a shallow throwaway book just for entertainment and reading something profound, something by Dostoevsky, let's say, or by some great literary figure. The deeper books move you in a more profound way. And so we have this instinct for profundity, and you want to pursue what's in the most profound depths. And the farther down you go into the depths of profundity, the more you encroach upon the religious domain. I also mean that technically.
To me, it all sounds very logical, and it's even, I'm sorry to say, even simple, kind of. It's from the basics of the life. But
it's simple once you figure it out.
Exactly. I think I have also watched lots of debates with you at YouTube, and I think your opponents just don't get it, because you are a man who is...
Well, they often don't. They're not actually talking to me. They're talking to a figment of their imagination.
Social construction, I would put it this way. But you stick to the scientific facts.
As much as I can.
Yes. And also, what is very important for you is the faith of younger generation. Because this is my interpretation, they have been bombed very much by the messages of the nowadays media and social media especially.
And at the education system. Yeah, they're demoralized. Both young men in particular are demoralized, I would say, on 3 dimensions. First of all, their childhood behavior, their natural play preferences, thing-oriented, and to some degree weapon-oriented, aim-oriented, competitive game-oriented, rough and tumble play, all of that, more masculine side of play, that's all deemed inappropriate right from the beginning, which is an absolute catastrophe. And then in schools, boys are taught, and girls too, boys are taught that any masculine ambition is nothing but a manifestation of the force that constitutes the oppressive patriarchy. And so it's just a pathological social force, and that means in marriage, it means in friendship, it means in the community, in employment, all of that. That's all off the table. And then if there's any part of you that escapes from that, well, then you're a planet-destroying, environmentally corrupt force. And so it's just awful. It's awful what that does to young men in particular. And then, of course, it has a knock-off effect on young women, because you can't make a claim like that about masculinity without making the same claim about the masculine strivings in women, and those are the strivings that drive them into the career world. And you can't demoralize young men without demolishing young women, obviously. I mean, it doesn't take a genius to figure that out.
So what is the solution? Of course, you have some suggestions by your books, but briefly saying, what can we do about this unhappy situation?
Well, there are things we really know how to do. So one finding that's very well documented in the clinical and research literature is that thoughts that pertain to yourself, so let's say self-conscious thoughts, are very tightly associated with the experience of negative emotion. So it's literally the case that when you're thinking about yourself, you're unhappy. And so what's the antidote to that? And you might say, well, stop thinking about yourself, but you can't just stop thinking about yourself. If you try, you just think about yourself more. You get into a loop.
Because we just said we should not think too much about others.
Well, we shouldn't think too much about what others, we shouldn't compare ourselves to others in a detrimental way, but we should be thinking about others almost all the time. And so, for example, imagine that you would like to be happy and you're married. Try making your wife happy. And that'll make you happy, or at least it'll stop you from being miserable. That's a good start. Pay a lot of attention to your kids.
But what if wife is a narcissist?
Well,
it's very hard to make a narcissist happy.
Yes, this is true. It's impossible. Yeah, well, now and then you find yourself in a situation where you're dealing with someone who's been very badly damaged for one reason or another, and that requires a lot more time and attention, and sometimes it requires not being there. So, and that's a decision that people have to make for themselves, because they're the only ones that have the information at hand. But imagine that. So, for example, one of the questions I've been asked quite repeatedly on the last tour is, how do I find the person who's right for me on social media, dating platforms, or just in the general world? And that question comes up a lot, phrased like that. And I don't know how to answer that question. Like, how do you find the person that's right for you? But I can say, generically, that's not a good question. It's the wrong question. And if you pose the question like that, you will not find an answer. The right question is, how can I make myself into the most attractive possible mating possibility? And
the answer to that is?
Well, with young men, a huge part of the answer to that is clean up your room, put your life in order.
Make your bed.
Yeah, start there at least. But what you're aiming at is highly productive generosity with some spine, right? Because if you're generous and productive, you can be taken advantage of, so you have to be able to say no. But productive generosity, man, that'll get you a long way. And certainly we know women are hypergamous. They mate across and up hierarchies of competence. And so essentially what women are looking for, there's other factors, physical attractiveness and so forth. What women are fundamentally looking for is productive generosity. And the reason they're looking for that, in large part, is because if they're going to have children, they're going to make themselves vulnerable and on the economic and physical fronts. And so they need someone around who can help balance the scales. And we know that perfectly well about female behavior. There's no mystery there. It's well documented cross-culturally. It's an extraordinarily powerful driving force for women in mate choice. And it makes perfect sense both economically and biologically. I mean, women are self-conscious. They know that having children is a major undertaking that also threatens to undermine their own autonomy because children are very dependent. So they look for men who can and will support, produce, and share, but who, like I said, who also are able to say, when enough is enough. And so if you want to find the right person, then you should be the right person. And then the problem will just take care of itself, right? If you're productive and generous enough as a man, you won't have any trouble getting a date.
Absolutely.
You'll have the opposite trouble. And so,
too many dates.
And that's a good problem if you have to have one.
Good. We are here in Estonia in the most wonderful piano factory managed and run by Indrek Lau. What else have you seen here in Estonia while you have been here a few days, and you will have, of course, your presentation tonight?
Well, I'm in the old city, the old town, and so that's unbelievably beautiful, and I could say a few things about that. I mean, Europe is a place of pilgrimage, and we don't think of it that way, but we should. You have more tourists in Europe than you have citizens, and the question is, well, why is that? And the answer is very straightforward. It's beauty, period, the end. And especially for someone from New York, or from North America, but from any more modern place, coming to Europe is nourishing in an extraordinarily deep way to see these old communities and these beautiful buildings. It's necessary. It's not optional. That's why people spend so much money doing it. That's why they work to be able to do it. They work at things they don't want to do to be able to come and spend a week in Paris or a week in Milan or a week in Tallinn.
You have enjoyed your time here.
It's beautiful. The old town is so beautiful. It's crazily beautiful. And it's concerning. The more modern Europe becomes, the more it looks generic. And as an economic decision, it's so foolish. You have this immense heritage of stunning beauty, and it's almost incalculably financially worthwhile. It's like, capitalize on that. That's what you have to offer the world, and it's something. It's something. It's not power and dominion and oppression and the oppressive imperial patriarchy. That's not it at all. At minimum, it's beauty. And beauty, well, that's Dostoevsky's line, beauty will save the world.
Absolutely. And my final question is, we have really made lots of work to make our country beautiful, our old town beautiful, but we are afraid of Russia.
Yes.
They may come and reconquer again.
Yeah.
And I have a question which you may or may not answer because you don't definitely have the information available. But as a clinical psychologist, what do you think? Is Mr. Putin crazy?
No, definitely not. No, you never want to underestimate the people that you're at war with. That's a big mistake. I see no evidence at all for clinical psychopathology on Putin's side. And Russians are complicated, and he's complicated. He is by no means the worst leader that Russia's had in the last 100 years, not by any stretch of the imagination. I'm not standing up for Putin, but I'm not going to casually demonize him. You can't take your simplistic understanding of Adolf Hitler or Joseph Stalin, which is incomplete, and then say, well, that's Putin. It's like, look, we're in trouble here. Wars tend to spread, and everyone thought when the First World War started, it'd be a few months. And then when it wasn't, they thought, well, we'll win easily. It's like, no, that isn't what's going to happen. And the people thought the same thing in World War II. And they thought the same thing in Afghanistan. And so this is a localized Ukraine-Russia conflict. Well, first of all, no, it's not. It's a war by proxy of Russia against the entire West. Obviously, now all the world isn't on board with that, but much of the world is, but not all of it. And so, you know, you might say when your sleeve gets caught in an industrial machine and only an inch of your sleeve is in, you think, well, I've still got my whole arm. It's like, yeah, for the next 10 minutes. But don't be thinking that that's how it's going to be in half an hour. And it'll be an absolute bloody miracle if this doesn't engulf us all. And there's a high probability of that. With all of that, all that entails, what would it mean for the Russians to lose? Like, let's say that's what the West wants. We want Russia to lose. Okay, well, what do you mean by that, lose exactly? Do you want the Russians to feel that they're going to lose? They have atom bombs. What is going to happen to a country that's already paranoid and misguided if they also think they're going to lose? You think they're just going to lose and we're not going to lose along with them? That's not going to happen. And so we're playing with fire on, and I think I've written an article called The Civil War in the West, because I think what's happening in Russia and Ukraine is a civil war in the West. That's just where it started. Russia's the West. And it's not just about post-Soviet territorial expansion. It's not just about oil and gas. It's definitely about those things, but it's about way more. It's about the stunning blindness and stupidity of Europe on the energy front. Who didn't know this was going to happen? Who's so blind that they believed that making Europe dependent on Russian oil and gas for environmental reasons wasn't going to produce this? And, well, we didn't know. Well, if you're a statesman and you didn't know that, you are so incompetent that it defies comprehension, because that's so self-evident. And so now we're in that situation.
It's a question about responsibility and the long perspectives.
Yeah, and the practical perspective too. You know, it's, well, you have these idiot environmental utopian ideas. Well, what are you willing to sacrifice to that? Well, how about the energy stability of Europe? Okay, great. Well, now here we are. So, you know, we're dreaming of a planet where there aren't people to be a cancerous growth. Well, enough nuclear exchange and we might just get that. So we're playing with fire.
Let's keep our fingers crossed that we can still survive
for
the next 100, 500 years as civilization.
1 year.
Even 1 year would be.
Yeah, even 1 year. There's going to be mass starvation in the fall. There's going to be mass migration into Europe again. Obviously, like, the writing is on the wall. The UN is already projecting 150 million people in the fall will face, what do they call that? Food insecurity, by which they mean skyrocketing prices and famine, food insecurity, famine. So yeah, it's really not good.
I would end with one very good advice from your book. And that is, do not let your children do anything that makes you dislike them.
Yeah, that's a real good one.
That's a closing argument.
Yeah, that's a good one. That's a good one.
Thank you, Professor Peterson,
My
very
pleasure.
much for conversation.
My
And good
pleasure.
luck with your work.
Well, thank you very much.